The Ukraine war began 4 years ago this week. It has become a bloody war of attrition. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and continue to die every day. Many of them have been Ukrainian civilians, including quite a number of children. The conflict has reshaped global politics and alliances. Russia describes the war as a broad conflict against an expansionist West. Ukraine and its allies see the war as an attempt to roll back a revanchist Russia yearning to reestablish empire. I am Borzu Deragahi, a longtime journalist and foreign correspondent. I am the author of the newsletter Badlands, and you can watch and read my content at borzu.substack.com. Please consider subscribing. Today, I'm joined by Anton Shekovtsov. He is a Ukrainian scholar at the Central European University in Vienna. He specializes in far-right and fascist movements in Europe. He's also the co-founder of the Center for Democratic Integrity based in Vienna. Anton, may I ask you just because a lot of people are so tuned out about what's happening in Ukraine, it's very different than it was a couple years ago. But what is the status of the war at this point as you see it? Are the Ukrainians or the Russians? I guess no one is really winning at this point, but are the Ukrainians or the Russians more or less losing this war of attrition? Which side is doing worse at this point?
Well, thank you very much for having me. As you mentioned, it's a war of attrition, and it's very difficult for any side to win a war of attrition. Generally, it's not only about Ukraine and Russia. So essentially, the question is who is spending more resources in this war, and it appears that, at least in terms of human resources, it's Russia that is losing many more people than Ukraine. But at the same time, um, Russia is taking over some territories. Then the Ukrainians are winning those some of those territories back. But at the same time, it's not about territories. We cannot evaluate the state of the war by looking at territories that go back and forth. I can't say that any side really is winning. So I presume it's what it is. It is a war of attrition, and uh, there's no possibility of saying who's doing what.
Well, obviously, the Russians have the advantage in terms of manpower, as you mentioned. Um, are the Ukrainians able to match that in some way? I know Ukrainians are getting tired as well. And it seems like Russia has this advantage in that it has this sort of class society where the people who are bearing the fight of who are bearing the weight of the conflict are mostly from the hinterlands, members of Russia's ethnic minorities, and so on, as well as the poorer people, while the wealthier enclaves in Moscow and St. Petersburg are not really impacted as much by the ongoing fight. But Ukraine has a very different dynamic. It also doesn't have the ready access to certain mineral resources that Russia has. Do you think that the Ukrainians are? Let me put it this way: do you think that the Ukrainians are that there is in the back of the Ukrainians' mind a kind of notion that they will have to give in to some of Russia's demands at some point?
Well, if we look at, of course, Russia has more human power, manpower to fight the war, but at the same time, if we look at the proportions, the difference in manpower between Russia and Ukraine, we will see that because Russia is not really valuing human life, even among their own troops, the proportion of those who are killed in action and heavily wounded is still this. It doesn't really play in to Russia's part. Yeah, so they are still losing more, even considering that they have a bigger pool of people who they can recruit for the war. At the same time, the traditional methods of recruitment that Russia relied on, those, voluntary contracts with the Russian armed forces, it's starting to decrease the number of who of those people who can be recruited for the war effort. So at some point they will probably have to go again for the partial mobilization, but the next time it will be much more difficult. So at the same time, no, of course, Ukrainians are tired. It's not 4 years of the war; it's 4 years of the full-scale invasion. The war is going on since 2014, since the Russian occupation of Crimea in late February
And
2014.
Donetsk, yeah.
Yeah, and the spring invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk Republic oblasts. But of course, Ukrainians are tired. Of course, they would like to go back to a normal life. This is all very understandable, and we do see the number or percentage of Ukrainian people who probably would be ready to give up some Ukrainian territories in
Mm,
exchange for peace. We do see these numbers, these percentage rising. This is not a critical percentage, at least yet, but at the same time, I'm sure there is an understanding that the peace for which Ukrainians or some Ukrainians would be ready to give up some Ukrainian territories has to be a firm peace. It has to be a stable peace, not just a peace, written on a word piece written on a paper that will be just torn down once again by the Russian side. And there is an understanding that for Russia, it's not a war for some territories. It is a war that aims at eradicating Ukrainian nationhood. It's aiming at eradicating the Ukrainian nation state. So it is about the destruction of the nation state. They can do this by dismembering Ukraine. They can do this by forcing Ukraine to surrender. There are many ways, but it's not really about territories. Yeah.
yeah. I'm going to
So
circle.
the
I'm going to circle back to this question again about the sort of Ukrainian mindset. But I wanted to ask. I know your specialty is the Central Europe, Eastern Europe, as well as Ukraine and Russia. So what about the fact that the countries after the initial enthusiasm, Romania, Poland, Central Europe, the Central European countries, the Visegrad countries, does enthusiasm there for this conflict appear to be waning? I mean, they're a crucial part of it. They are NATO partners, but they're also the ones that are not only are they NATO partners, but they're also the ones that are driving driving NATO and the EU, the effort there to support they're providing the political cover and the kind of energy, the political energy to support the Ukrainians. Is the enthusiasm waning, or rather, how much is the enthusiasm waning?
well, it's difficult to say. Obviously, there is what can be called Ukraine fatigue. The war is not ending. Europeans also spending a lot of their own resources to support Ukraine and this defensive war. But I think the consensus still holds. The consensus that that Europe should support Ukraine, and there is the obvious logic behind this, because if Ukraine falls, then European security will be in shatters. The fall of Ukraine would trigger the crisis on the European continent that
Mm,
will cost much more than Europe is now spending on support for Ukraine. And at the same time, we see the preparations on the Russian side for a potential conventional, even conventional conflict with Europe, with European nations beyond Ukraine. And I think also the Western intelligence services are talking about the period of around from 3 to 4 to 5 years when Russia would be prepared for a conventional attack
Mhm.
against Europe. So the Ukrainians, by resisting against Russian aggression, are buying other Europeans time to prepare for a bigger conflict, and the developments in Russia, and uh, they show that they are getting ready. They are getting ready in many ways, on land,
Yeah.
on sea, and in space.
What about the American resolve? How does it seen? I mean, I see the American resolve, falling apart to some extent. I
But
see
it's already
voices
done.
pushing. What do you mean it's done?
I mean, the U.S. is no longer providing any free assistance to
Yeah,
Ukraine. Since the
sure.
return to power of President Trump, and all those statements that the U.S. would support Ukraine as long as it takes. Yeah, Biden was president there, but it was still about the U.S. and commitments of the U.S. to support Ukraine. They all gone, but these are not the only commitments that appear to be gone. The U.S. is no longer a 100% ally of Europe, so it must be taken into consideration.
And how is that impacting, just as a little bit of a side note, how is that impacting Central European and Eastern European security concerns, especially among those who are on the front lines of the Ukraine war?
Well, it depends on what countries specifically we're talking about. I think countries like Hungary or Slovakia, at least their leadership,
Yeah.
they are not very much concerned about the challenges that Russia poses. But at the same time, if we're talking about the Baltic states, Poland, I'm sure they are concerned. And while they keep on relying on the US, of course, for assistance, there are Europe-wide initiatives that that essentially aiming at replacing the US as the main provider of security and defense in Europe.
What impact do you think that'll have in the long run? I mean, in countries like Romania, is it going to have um, do you think that Europe is getting its act together in terms of this long-held dream of creating a security umbrella that is not so dependent on the US? Is that happening?
The path towards strategic autonomy, I think it's already there.
Hmm.
Europe already knows what it needs to do to achieve that strategic autonomy, meaning independence from the US on the continent's defense and security. The question is whether European nations are all fully committed to this path. Here we have some questions, not only about the countries that I mentioned, but perhaps about some other countries, Romania including. The rearmament plan has been already announced by the European Commission, so this is happening. And the question here is also about the speed with which Europe is able to rearm itself. But there are other issues. For example, preparedness, even psychological preparedness of Europeans to fight and defend their not necessarily a united Europe, but their own fatherlands or motherlands. It is quite a problem in so many countries across the EU, across NATO, European NATO member states. The percentage of those people who are prepared to defend their land with weapons in their arms is much less than 50%.
Yeah.
Um, so there are many issues
Yeah.
that need to be solved, but the understanding, I think, the bigger picture of how to get there, how to get to strategic autonomy, it's
Is
it's already in
there.
the minds of Europeans. Yes.
Just to circle back a little bit again towards the settlement of this thing, um, would you say that Russia's bargaining position has improved as the impact of sanctions has basically been shown to be not so powerful, as the diplomatic isolation of Russia seems to have, I guess, weakened, as this Eurasian alliance with China has grown in importance, and as the global South seems to not really care about the Ukraine conflict, is it in a better position now to settle on an end game that is in its favor?
In many ways, Russia is also exhausted
Hmm.
by this war, for which they didn't really plan. They didn't plan
Hmm.
for 4 years
4
of
years.
full-scale invasion. This is
Wow.
for sure. What they planned was an actual special military operation that is quick, that is like a lightning. They had an opportunity actually of carrying out this very very fast operation, but they failed. But anyway, so they are exhausted, and they do understand that they would rather try again the non-military solution, or the non-military achievement of their objectives. Again, their objectives do not change. The objective is the subjugation of Ukraine. It's the destruction of the Ukrainian nation state. The question is that it can be achieved by different means. Conventional war, the war that is now being waged by Russia, is just one of those instruments. It's one of those ways. If they can achieve the same objective, the same goal by diplomatic means, or so-called diplomatic means, because this is basically coercion and maybe even collusion with some Western countries, they would be fine with this. It doesn't matter for them how exactly they want to achieve the goal. The lifeline for the Russian war effort is China.
Yeah.
Without China, the war, I'm sure, would have been over much earlier. This is now the economic lifeline. This is the political lifeline. As you mentioned, I think this international isolation of Russia is over. This
Yeah.
is the situation of yesterday, even the day before yesterday. So in many ways, Russia is in a better shape, yeah, politically, but in many ways, economy and it's in a worse shape. But what's important is that the Kremlin's, Moscow's tolerance to the hard times, to the exhaustion, it's much higher than
Hmm.
in the West.
Yeah.
It's just uncomparable. And another important point and important factor that many, in my opinion, miss or fail to register when observing or when analyzing the situation is different temporalities that are driving politics in the West and politics in Russia. And by temporalities, I mean that what is the time cycles that are important for Western nations, say electoral cycles, the terms in which governments operate. These are not the cycles that are of interest or of significance for Russia. They may actually think in dozens of years, or in decades. Yeah.
Yeah.
For Putin, this war, first, it's not about territory. It's the war of his own historical legacy.
Yeah.
This is the war of how he
Yeah.
thinks on himself in the future, how he will be remembered. And, he
So,
has a role model of Peter the First, and for him, it's about centuries. It's not about electoral cycles. It's a different
Anton,
temporality.
Anton, given what you're saying, is there even a deal? Is there a realistic deal to be had, given the metaphysical way in which one side views the conflict? Is there a possibility of a deal? And what, in your opinion, would a realistic deal look like?
Well, first, I firmly believe that as long as Putin is in power or lives
Mm,
or somehow has a relation to decision making in Russia, the war will go on in one way or another, whether it will be the same intensity, the war of attrition, or it will become more intense, or maybe it will, be a kind of what was happening before 2022. Um,
mm.
so kind of a limited war, yeah, but it will go on because for Putin, it's an existential activity for him. If there is a kind of a deal or a solution or agreement, gonna be like a bad peace that will be broken at the first possibility for the
Mm.
Russians. So while I would say that, of course, it's a Russian war. It's the war of a Russian state against Ukraine.
Okay,
It's a war of a
let's
country.
well.
But uh, Putin's own, the factor, the individual factor of Putin is very important.
So, but like, given that, what would a kind of ceasefire even look like? What would so I see what you're saying that, even if there is an end to the conflict, it'll continue as long as Putin has this ambition. He'll use his gray zone operations. He'll provoke other conflicts and so on. He'll make lunges. He'll test, etc. But what would a temporary ceasefire look like? We haven't even had a real ceasefire in this 4 years. That is a
There
quite an
will be no
incredible thing.
ceasefire. There will be no ceasefire. That is for sure. The Russians are not interested in a ceasefire. They said it several times. They are interested in a settlement, yeah, which presumes the non-existence of Ukraine as an independent state.
So they wouldn't be satisfied at this point with just a temporary ceasefire that would give them Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. That would not be enough, in your
Well,
opinion.
this is not the objective. The objective is not Crimea. The objective is not some territories, East
Yeah,
Ukrainian territories. There
yeah.
will be no ceasefire. There
But
will
there
be.
hasn't been. It's quite extraordinary that even in World War I there were temporary ceasefires, but not in this conflict. Um, that's kind of depressing, I gotta say. But just to focus a little bit on the your other areas of expertise, I wanted to get at that. What do you think about what's happening with Hungary and Slovakia? Hungary could flip, and that would be quite extraordinary if Orban lost. But what do you think is the role of these two countries at this point in Europe and in the Ukraine conflict?
Well, these two countries are still different, although their positions overlapping. Now we see, for example, that both are trying to put pressure on Ukraine about the Druzhba pipeline.
Mhm.
They still want to buy Russian energy that is being transported via Ukraine, but they are different in the sense that Viktor Orban appears to be ideologically driven, so not only politically, not only economically driven, but also ideologically driven to side with the Russians and with the larger far-right agenda in Europe, while Robert Fico and his government, they are more pragmatic. They are both spoilers in this situation. They are countries that are undermining the consensus on Russia. Again, I would like to refer back, for example, to the inability of the European Commission first to provide a 90 billion loan to Ukraine because of Hungary's position,
Mm.
but also the inability to adopt a 20th sanctions package. This is all on Hungary. But Slovakia would probably not act the same way if they were alone in this, opposition to support for Ukraine. Hungary would
Interesting.
definitely go it alone, do it alone, and
It
not.
did do it alone for a while. Yeah.
Yes, it did. It was joined
Yeah.
by Slovakia, but I think that Slovakia alone would not do
So
this. They would
that
somehow stick
just
to the consensus.
that highlights the importance of this upcoming election in Hungary. In addition to Trump, there's also this possibility that Nigel Farage could win the vote in the UK next year, and that Marine Le Pen's party with I forget his name. His name escapes now. Bardella in France could of the Rassemblement National of the National Front successor could win in France. What will that? I mean, that'll be an earthquake for Europe, obviously. What will that mean for Ukraine? And I wonder if in your analysis and possible discussions with Ukrainian officials and so on, are they thinking about that? Is that putting a kind of a deadline on the need to make gains in the war or to come to some kind of acceptable settlement?
Well, I don't have access to Ukrainian officials, and I can only speak about my own observations. I
Sure.
don't think that Ukrainian government or Ukrainian diplomats are exploring those contacts, at least publicly. Maybe there are some behind the curtain activity, behind the closed door activity, them reaching out to those far right figures whom you mentioned, because, well, indeed, come Farage to power in the UK, that will probably completely change the UK stances, and Ukraine's support for Ukraine will diminish dramatically. With France, I'm not so sure, because if we're talking about Marine Le Pen, she she is not necessarily friendly towards Russia, but she used to be. So there are some contacts
Mm,
and also people around her who would try to steer her in a more pro-Russian way. But if Jordan Bardella becomes president of France, we may not necessarily see a dramatic
mm,
change in France's position towards the war, because Bardella, he is representing a younger generation of
mm,
this far right party, for whom actually Ukraine's war for its own independence, for its own sovereignty, probably is more sympathetic than the
mm.
imperialist ambitions of the Russians. So. There are other, of course, very worrying developments also in Germany, with the alternative for Germany being very
Interesting.
popular but they will probably not be able to govern alone. They will need
A
to have a
coalition partner.
coalition, yes, and other major parties, they are firmly, I hope, still on Ukraine's side. But the UK, yes, that is a matter of concern. But again, talking about Ukraine's position, whether they are preparing for
For
those
that.
scenarios, I don't know, and
Mm,
I don't think so, because it
yeah.
also be very sensitive, politically sensitive. I'm sure, obviously, the intelligence and counterintelligence services of those countries, in France and the UK, they would know that the Ukrainians are
Mm.
reaching out to those
Officials.
actors, politicians, yeah, and that would be problematic.
Well, great. I think that's all the time that we have. Anton, thank you so much. Again, I'm Borzu Deragahi. This has been a podcast for my newsletter, Badlands. Please subscribe so that I can bring you more content like this. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
brother. Thank you for the
Thank
invitation.
you.